Welcome. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the organizers for the Socialist Night School. My pronouns are he and him. The Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, historical and current events related to socialism. While everyone is welcome, these sessions are especially designed for those who are newer to socialism, to DSA, and to the topics covered. Our night school is one leg of our political education school, along with our extensive reading group program and our walking tour program, which we'll talk about a little bit. Night school was founded based on the notion that organizing and political education are not properly understood in tension, but rather mutually reinforcing. I'm really excited to be kicking off the year with this event. This book ties together so many aspects of our work in DSA: labor, Medicare for all, socialist feminism, defund MPD, just to name a few. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Particularly, we want to make sure we have some time and space to talk about what this all means for our organizing today. For those of you who've joined us before, you know here at Socialist Night School, we insist that socialism is not something you believe, but it's something you do. It's something you struggle for and organize for. To that end, at the end, we will have some suggestions for further political education, as well as ways you can get plugged into work. If you have any problems with the audio or the video, please let us know in the chat. And now I want to introduce our presenter. Gabriel Winant is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago. His writing about work, inequality, and capitalism in modern America has appeared in The Nation, The New Republic, Dissent, and N+1. And his new book is The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. Over, Gabe.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for having me. Could we go to like a discussion type, I don't know if we need to have the poster of my book up.
Yeah, we can pull the slide down.
Thanks. I don't know, folks may not want to have the cameras on, which is fine. But anyway, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. Something crazy is happening with my video. Okay, it seems to be over. It's really good to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It means a lot, when you write a book of like labor history, based in kind of Marxist analysis, it's sort of like a distant hope that groups of activists and organizers and workers will want to read it together or talk about it together or, use it in some way for their own political struggles. So anyway, I'm very glad and grateful to have the chance to join you. So I know we're going to kind of have a kind of conversation between Taylor and me, is that right? But I don't know if it would make sense for me to say a few introductory things about the book, or if you want to just dive right in.
You start with your part, and then we'll have a couple different people, maybe Taylor, maybe
okay,
popping in. Yeah.
So okay, I don't want to go on too long. I realize people here have maybe not read the book. I hope you will, but this is a book that's the book tries to do a couple different things that I hope are useful in kind of different ways. At the most basic level, I wrote this book. It was my dissertation in graduate school. I started working on it in 2010, 11, 12, those years after the financial crisis had happened and the Great Recession, and inequality was back on the agenda. It was something people were talking about again and cared about again. But class had not really kind of reemerged in the same way with that, right? Instead, it was much more of the kind of like Thomas Piketty, if people know that kind of 99%, 1% kind of mathematical formula type thing about how income is distributed, as opposed to like lived social experience of class, which might where you can observe inequality and exploitation, but also potentially solidarity, right? That's traditionally the reason we study class in the way that we do as Marxists, as a social relationship, as opposed to a kind of mathematical relationship, because we're interested in how exploitation also creates the possibility of solidarity. And I started thinking about, okay, well, why is this? Why has class analysis not kind of come back in this moment? What would we have to do to bring it back? And the thing that I kept running into was that it seemed to me there was a lot of kind of confusion or conflation that had happened between class analysis as a kind of method of thought coming from Marx in some ways, although other sources too, a way of thinking about the world, understanding the kind of cleavages that divide groups of people in capitalist societies, And so that was kind of one thing. And then at the same time, there was also like this one major example of class analysis and class formation, which is how groups of exploited people come together to form kind of shared identities. One major example of that we had, which was the industrial working class, as it emerged in the late 19th century, became organized in the early 20th century, won democracy and the welfare state between 1900 and 1950, and then went into kind of a terminal economic decline with its organizations and unions and parties being destroyed largely or very badly weakened in the second half of the 20th century. So on the one hand, we have the concept of class. On the other hand, we basically have like this one big example of it. And then we lost that example. And so then the question was like, can we still use this concept? This was the question that seemed to me. Or what would we have to do to figure out what was the kind of baby here and what was the bathwater? What can we still use from the kind of Marxist tradition, and what was actually a kind of specific observation of the experience of the industrial working class that it was not possible to tell at the time, was just a specific observation. So that was the kind of overall problem I was interested in getting at. And so I figured, it might be helpful to write a book that traces the process of class formation forward through deindustrialization, right? Rather than treating the kind of moment when the factory closes as the end of the story of the working class, which I think tacitly was how we tended to treat it. And in fact, often explicitly, there was a lot of talk in the 80s and 90s in the moment of deindustrialization about the end of class, farewell to the working class, these kinds of ideas. Instead of treating it as an endpoint, what if we could observe the way that class is something that kind of always gets reformulated and reinvented through social struggles? So that's the basic goal of the book. It's a study of Pittsburgh from 1950 to about the year 2000, as Pittsburgh went from having steel as its overwhelmingly most important employer. Steel was at its peak about 20% of the labor market in Pittsburgh, 1 in 5 jobs, to having healthcare as its most important employer, which is similarly up close to 20% of employment there now. I thought if I could trace that process and show how people lived it out in their everyday lives, then I would be able to say something about the possible sources of working class solidarity, even within the kind of increasingly unequal society that has come about through deindustrialization and neoliberalism over the last 30, 40 years. So that's a kind of general overview of what the book is trying to do. And then it kind of gets way into the weeds of the healthcare system and how the healthcare system works, and how families were organized and how they change over time, how the steel industry changed over time. And we can talk more about all of that. But that's the kind of overview I want to start with.
So thank you so much, Gabe. And appreciate the overview of the book. Was wondering, don't want to make this all about DC. Want to, definitely cover the territory in your book, but do want to acknowledge we're in a town that did not have the same concentration of industry, and just want to acknowledge like your book, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book about South LA, had these like industrial plants that closed down in a fairly rapid succession, fairly dramatic tale. But I was just kind of curious, beyond class, how does deindustrialization affect other cities with a different concentration, such as perhaps the district, area around DC, in the same time period you're talking about, which, you can talk about a little, but, I assume 50s through the 80s is a rough time period. Can you say a little bit about deindustrialization beyond manufacturing industry?
Yeah, so maybe let me kind of back up and just sort of say a word about the connection between industrial employment, as I try to draw it in the book, and healthcare and the healthcare industry, and then I'll talk about DC kind of coming off of that. So one observation that I make is that in the book is that if you just kind of like look at urbanized counties in America, how much of their workforce is in healthcare and social assistance, what's a census category? The list of the top 25 or something is like Buffalo, Rochester, Erie, Cleveland, Milwaukee. I mean, off the top of my head, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, Worcester, Massachusetts. It's very clear what you're looking at, right? It's very clearly a map of deindustrialization. The places that have the largest, proportionally largest healthcare workforces in America are the places that 60, 70 years ago had the largest industrial workforces. And that's because, this is one of the book arguments the book makes, that's because following the kind of containment and defeat of the left wing of the New Deal at the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s and early 1950s, organized labor kind of was forced to settle for constructing a private sector welfare state for itself, right? And this is something we all know very intimately. You get your healthcare, you get many of your other social rights like retirement and so on through your job. And that was a kind of result of a kind of unstable political compromise, right? That wasn't really anyone's idea. It just kind of eventuated as a result of class struggle in the 40s and 50s. And that kind of differentiated the working class in complicated ways, right? Because you had more economic security. Really, the only route to economic security was through a unionized industrial job or marriage to someone who had such a job, or being a child of someone who had such a job. And that differentiation then kind of mapped onto race and onto gender. But one thing that it did, when over the course of the 1950s, you had collectively bargained health plans proliferating across the American workforce, right, in industries like auto and steel and coal and electrical production and so on, all negotiating their first health plans in 49, 50, 51, 52, and then kind of improving them over the course of the 50s and into the 60s. This caused hospitals to invest and expand and kind of modernize. Hospitals before World War II had basically been places where the poor went to die. And it was in this period of the 50s and early 60s that they became something that we could kind of recognize today in their social function, right? As like houses of science where everyone goes to get intensive treatment when you need it. As that and doctors similarly kind of became increasingly specialized and so as this happens, medical care gets more costly. And the phenomenon that we now are very used to and think of as kind of natural and permanent, that healthcare just like gets more expensive all the time, sort of out of proportion to general inflation. That really started in this moment because there was a new huge source of demand in these health plans that people had. Lots of ordinary people for the first time had a health plan. So by the late 50s, you had people who were not part of that kind of secure minority of the working class that worked in steel or coal or whatever, or were connected to those people. Like people who couldn't get onto that island of security were being priced out of healthcare, and were increasingly making noise about it. And if you think about what groups am I describing when I say that, right? We're talking about people who are not middle class or wealthy, right? Because they can pay out of pocket or have insurance, through their professional jobs. We're talking about people who are working class or poor, but are not in a unionized industrial job. So that means people who are marginal in the labor market, right? People working as waiters and waitresses or cooks, or a million things that are not steel or coal. And it means retirees, right? People who maybe once had a good job, but have retired out of that workforce. And so those two constituencies by the late 50s are agitating increasingly for being included in some way in this new healthcare system that's coming online. And so already by like 1957, 1958, there's debate happening in Congress about the bills that will eventually become Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. A kind of temporary bill is passed, or kind of short-term solution is passed in 57. I'm making a complicated story simple, but basically Medicare and Medicaid are passed in 1965 as a solution to this problem. And I just want to say a word about Medicare and Medicaid. First of all, they're internally unequal, as I think everyone here probably knows. Medicare historically is the kind of better program. It's purely federal, right? So the states can't mess with it. And it reimburses providers at higher rates than Medicaid. which means it buys better care, and it's not means tested, right? You turn 65, you get it. Whereas Medicaid is for the poor, so it's means tested, it's stingier, et cetera. So that's how this problem is responded to. And what's important about that is two things. One, it positions the federal and state governments not as alternate providers of care, but as buyers of care, right? They stand themselves in as insurers alongside the kind of private insurers at the core of the healthcare market. So it actually, in some ways, kind of buffers and strengthens the public-private division of labor that has already been struck in the healthcare system. Second, it extends this kind of rising tide of demand for healthcare that was really powerful in places like Pittsburgh and Detroit and so on. It extends it nationally to some extent. And this brings us to DC. I'm sorry for the very roundabout answer. But even in places where there was not a significant industrial workforce, through this kind of indirect process I've just described, class struggle in manufacturing expanded the welfare state, right? It left this kind of political imprint on the institutions of the federal and state government, expanded their fiscal footprint, and began to subsidize demand there for healthcare. And so there's a floor under the healthcare, it puts a floor under the healthcare system everywhere, right? There's some places that have these really big healthcare systems, like a Pittsburgh or a Cleveland or something, but everywhere it can't fall too low because of this baseline federal support, both for demand, and Medicare also subsidizes capital expansion. So if you want to build a hospital or add a new wing or build a nursing home, you can get a lot of federal support for that as well. That's the kind of basic way I would include DC in the story. There's probably a bunch of further weird stuff, I would guess, about the specificities of public employment and the ways that federal employees wind up kind of operating in a position relatively similar, I mean, by the 60s and 70s anyway, a position relatively similar to auto or steel workers elsewhere, but I don't really know. It's just a kind of a hunch.
No, thank you for your response. And Dave, another question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the story on the steel end of the story. I feel, there's a mythology around industry, factory work, and maybe particularly steel, about the benefits of that for the workers and their families and for the community. And I think you puncture some of these myths, you push back on it, complicate it, which is important. So I'd like you to talk about that, but then also about the ways, the harms that were done at the individual, the community level, and more the societal level when those jobs went away. There's a pretty serious brutality to that. See it playing out in all ways. About that.
Yeah. So on the kind of both parts of that question, that you have to have a kind of a two-sided, a dialectical kind of way of thinking about it, because it's true that to get a job in American steel in the post-war period meant that you were a member of the best paid, basically like the best paid working class the world had ever seen, right? And we should not deny that. That's the kind of core of the myth of this post-war golden age that we just could kind of maybe go back to or recover or something like that. There were tremendous gains that working class people made in many, many ways. And it's really important to kind of see and recognize that, while we also kind of strip away some of the mythology simultaneously. I think probably people are pretty familiar with this mythology, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time like recapitulating it, except just to say that folks maybe know the famous scene in 1959 when Nixon goes to Moscow, what's often called the kitchen debate. Nixon is vice president, and there's like an American expo of some kind in Moscow, and so he goes, and there's this famous scene where he and Khrushchev, who was the premier of the USSR at the time, tour this like model American home, and they arrive at the kitchen, and they have this little like ideological debate. You can watch a video of it or read it. It's very funny. Khrushchev in particular is very funny. And Nixon says, look, I want to show you this kitchen. it has all these modern appliances in it. And like the first thing he says, basically, as they kind of step into it is, as you may know, or here's something you'd be interested in, our steel workers are on strike right now. But any steel worker could buy this home. They make $3 an hour. And Khrushchev kind of says like, yeah, we got stuff like this too. And Nixon says, well, in America, it's important to us to have homes like this because we want to make things easy for our women, pointing to the dishwasher and the refrigerator and so on. And Khrushchev says, in the Soviet Union, we don't show your attitude toward women. And Nixon says, I think everyone has this attitude toward women. And like that's what happened in the kitchen debate. That's the core of it. It's this kind of famous event, and people don't really remember that they were arguing about the standard of living of steelworkers and the relations between steelworkers and their wives. So in 1959, steelworkers did stage what remains to this day the largest strike in U.S. history in terms of person hours idled. It's about 400,000 or 500,000 workers on strike for nearly 4 months. And this was one of a series of strikes that they had in 46, 49, 52, 54, 56, and 59, I think. So they went on strike like 5 or 6 times over the 15 years after World War II. They also were periodically laid off in the recessions that happened periodically in the years after World War II. There were recessions in about a similar number. I can't remember exactly, but there are 4 or 5 recessions, or 3 or 4 recessions over those 15 years. And so, in fact, the kind of steel worker who earns $3 an hour is not nearly as comfortable as Nixon is representing, because although his wages are pretty good, he's actually not earning them for a full work year, almost any year. Moreover, the situation is gradually, in some ways, getting worse over the course of the post-war period because steel, it entered, as was true for many American industries, it entered the post-war period with basically a world monopoly, right? The other industrial powers had been Germany, Japan, the USSR, and Great Britain, and they were basically all pulverized by the war. So America had 50% of world steel capacity in 1945. And the industry was very oligopolistic. There were 11 major companies, and they negotiated one contract together with the union. And when US Steel, the biggest of them, raised its prices, they would all raise their prices together. So it was not a competitive industry. There was very little global competition until the 60s and 70s. This made the industry, as was true for many American industries, quite complacent in the way that it was managed. They didn't invest in new technology very aggressively. This is why when German and Japanese companies come on the scene in the 70s and 80s, they're able to so rapidly outcompete American manufacturers. Basically their solution, the steel company's solution for its problems was, well, we'll just raise prices. Right. But the problem with this is if you raise prices on steel, the prices on everything go up because steel is in everything in post-war America, right? It's in the highways that are being built. It's in the skyscrapers that are being built. It's in the cars, most importantly, that, define this era of history. And so the president, whoever he is, whether it's Truman or Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson, really doesn't want steel prices to go up too much, but also really doesn't want a steel strike to happen for too long because that will also hurt the economy in another way. So every one of these strikes gets settled in the Oval Office. Whoever the president is always leaning on the company to kind of settle a good deal with the union and not raise prices too high. And steel companies are trying to kind of figure out how to deal with their rising labor costs and the pressure that they're under from the federal government to not raise prices too high. And a good way of dealing with this, they discover, is to try to speed up their workforce. And this is very, very explicit in the archival material. You just find memo after memo after memo from steel managers in the 50s and 60s saying, like, can we get 3 guys to do this job that 5 are doing right now? Just a huge amount of that. Can we cut this break from 20 minutes to 15? And, the workers are unionized, so they have to kind of fight it out, over every little thing like this. But over time, over the course of, the post-war decades, the steel workforce gradually shrinks. So something deindustrialization is something that we associate with this like sudden snap in the 1980s when it did fall off really rapidly. But actually, half of the total decline of the steel workforce happened between 1950 and 1980. And then the second half happened between 1980 and 1990, basically. So there's this kind of gradual grinding away at working conditions for steel workers, even as their wages are going up. Right, they're kind of worn out, they're kind of humiliated every day because they're having this fight with their boss all of the time over their quota or whatever. And this takes a toll on people. In addition, steel is an extremely dangerous industry. I mean, I've never met a single steel worker who didn't see someone die on the job. Injuries are totally ubiquitous. There's just, there's kind of both physical, kind of mechanical and chemical danger. And then there's kind of like, in the form of fire and so on. And then there's also kind of long-term, accumulation of toxins in bodies. So it's scary. And it gets scarier as you're being sped up. And steelworkers in various ways bring this home with them. There's a kind of ubiquitous ritual of, like having a drink after the mill. And, steelworkers will say explicitly about it, like, yeah, I kind of like needed to settle my nerves. Even if you get off your shift at 8 in the morning, right? Because steel mills run 24 hours a day. So even if you work a 12 with a midnight to 8 a.m. shift, the bars are open at 8 in the morning. So you can have a shot of whiskey or something before you go home. And then like this takes us into the home, the other side of Nixon's, kitchen thing. And if you then think about from the perspective of a steelworker's wife, right, a housewife, what this means, right? It means that one, they're supposed to have this economic security that they almost sort of have, but they never quite achieve it. And things are always like a little bit raggedy, and she has to sort of hold it together. They maybe have to, come have a couple uncles live with them and help make the mortgage payment or the rent. This is, very common patterns like this. But then, of course, like this means that, those guys are steel workers also. And so now the housewife has to probably cook like a couple dinners at least every day because they're all on different shifts. And then there's the kids. And the kids have to be quiet so they don't wake up the men in the household who, are trying to sleep during the day because they're working the night shift, etc. Right? It just becomes this huge sort of everyday ordeal to just like hold this thing together. And the working class family becomes this kind of critical site of what I think of as the privatization of a social problem, right? Like the problem of how to reproduce the American working class and provide it with economic security enough that it will, stop engaging in militant class struggle and enough that it will be available for employment. That problem is devolved onto the family or delegated to the family, in particular to women in the family, to kind of just figure out how to do it. And they actually just don't have the resources to do it. It's not possible to properly do it. But there's also no real way of dealing with that because it's not a public political problem. It's a problem that happens between husbands and wives and between parents and children. And so, every working class housewife who, I found records of has in one way or another, basically finds a way to say, in interviews and diaries, whatever, like, this is impossible, but I just need to make it work. And I think that is a really important element to add to the kind of general story about the kind of post-war golden age mythology, not just because like we should feel bad, about the exploitation of women, although we should, but because politically, it's a story about the division of the working class, right? About the ways that different elements of the working class are mobilized by capital differently for different purposes. And this has a demobilizing and disorganizing effect politically, which is something we should care about as socialists.
Thank you so much, Gabe, and appreciate you taking us into the steel industry and some of that history. Was going to ask you to bridge some of the parts, go to the next shift, essentially bridge the health plans that got created through this class struggle, and the steel world that created them, had a question about what the healthcare workforce in Pittsburgh and deindustrialized areas look like. Was there any organizing tradition that they drew on, or was it just the benefit plans that got them there? Can you talk a little bit about kind of early stages of staffing up and starting to organize in the health sector?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I realized I forgot to answer the second part of the previous question. I realized I went on very long though. Maybe I can try to squeeze that in here. So healthcare was when the New Deal was kind of being institutionalized in the 30s and 40s. Healthcare as a workplace was not really part of it. It had a kind of hospitals had a kind of ambiguous status under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is minimum wage, overtime, that kind of thing. And there was sort of some organization by healthcare workers in those years and some lawsuits trying to figure out, does the act cover these people or not? Because the act was justified as a regulation of interstate commerce. And hospitals were not really seen as commercial enterprises, right? They were philanthropic, nonprofit enterprises. They didn't really have interstate operations for that matter. And this is the argument that they made: we are not employers. The relationship we have to our staff is in fact like not an employer-employee relationship. Actually, the book begins with an episode in Pittsburgh in 2013 when the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest employer in Pennsylvania, now it employs like 100,000 people. It's, a huge hospital chain, made a version of this same argument in a National Labor Relations Board filing, saying, this union is seeking to use the NLRB to regulate our relationship with our employees, but they're actually not our employees. We're not an employer. And the specific legal logic was different in 2013 than it was in 1940. But I think the overall principle of the thing is basically the same, which is that healthcare institutions and the people who run them define what they're doing as not part of the economy. Right, it's this other thing. It's a kind of external adjunct that helps the economy run from the outside of it, but is not inside the economy and shouldn't be regulated like it's part of the economy. And whatever legal ambiguity there was about this in the 30s and 40s gets resolved by the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which is the kind of major rollback of New Deal labor rights that still plagues us to this day in various ways. And Taft-Hartley explicitly says, okay, hospitals are out; they're not covered. That lasted until the 70s. So the whole period I was talking about in my first answer, when the healthcare system is kind of being constructed, coming online, its institutions, the insurance pools and markets, the physical hospital apparatus, all this stuff that's kind of getting organized in the 50s and 60s and 70s, all of that is built on the assumption that healthcare is not actually part of the economy. Even eventually when hospitals, nursing homes are added to labor law in the 70s, they're added under kind of special extra burdens on unions, which still obtain today. So this is a kind of important legal and institutional element of how the healthcare workforce got constructed. What it meant was that healthcare workers were going to be hired from the most marginal elements of the labor market, right? Because it was a kind of work that was kind of being defined as sort of like being a wife, right? And that comparison was very common, right? This is sort of like a family situation, also sort of like being a domestic servant, which is also not really part of the economy. So in Pittsburgh, it's largely African Americans and women, and especially African American women, who kind of fill the ranks of the healthcare service workforce as it grows over the course of the 50s and 60s. And I see a comment about Local 1199. So, right, in New York City first, Local 1199, which began as a union of pharmacists and the kind of communist Jewish pharmacists in the 1930s, over the 40s and 50s kind of figured out how to organize whole hospitals, particularly Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx, and basically how to win union recognition hospital-wide outside of labor law, just through kind of pure militancy. And this became a kind of increasingly attractive and viable option outside New York over the course of the 60s because of the progress of the civil rights movement, right? Because so many of these workers were Black, and because their working conditions like had this quality of sort of unfreedom, right? Like they did not have the legal status of an employee, and they were constantly comparing hospitals to plantations and this kind of thing, and in some ways for good reason. The civil rights movement resonated very powerfully among hospital workers, and actually civil rights leaders recognized that. So Martin Luther King spent a ton of time with Local 1199, and after he died, Coretta Scott King became kind of like the honorary chairwoman of the union. I really recommend the documentary I Am Somebody, which is about this very heroic Local 1199 fight in Charleston, South Carolina in 1969. So right after King has been killed, in the heart of the old Jim Crow South, these poor Black women hospital workers fighting for union recognition with no legal protection. And so anyway, versions of that fight play out in a bunch of cities, including Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, as in Charleston, they're basically not able to win because of their legal vulnerability and because of the racial division of the workforce, that legal vulnerability allows the employer to exploit. So the employer sort of terrorizes the Black workers and succeeds in splitting off the white workers from them. The employer brings in the workers are doing like sit-ins and walkouts and this kind of stuff, and the employer invites in a rival union to kind of muddy the waters and try to confuse the workers. It does a pretty intense kind of race baiting and even kind of anti-Semitic thing, because the union is largely Black in its membership but largely Jewish in its leadership. And anyway, they still to the present have not succeeded in organizing. It's now Local 1199 is now part of SEIU, but still to the present, there's an ongoing campaign which has yet to succeed in organizing these hospitals, the kind of core hospitals in Pittsburgh. Although they do succeed in winning for statewide and then federal this change to labor law to get hospitals included, although, as I say, under somewhat burdened conditions. Let me now quickly address the second part of the last question about what deindustrialization did. So remember, I said we have to kind of see the two sides of the mythology of the Golden Age, and it's only if we see that we can kind of I think make sense fully of deindustrialization and how it plays out, because it's both this long gradual process that's both like that's sort of eroding communities and eroding workers' well-being, and this sudden kind of catastrophe that piles on at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. And basically, to sum it up quickly, what deindustrialization, the best way to understand, I think, how deindustrialization plays out is that it changes the population. It's a demographic event, which is to kind of try to get at some of its profundity. So, 150,000 manufacturing jobs are lost in Pittsburgh between 1975 and 1985. That's in a metro area of, at that point, about 2 million or something. So it's a huge job loss. Unemployment reaches 17% in 1983. So that's kind of like a Great Depression, nearly level of disaster. The early 80s recession was much, much worse in the industrial cities than it was nationally. That's coming on top of this kind of long, slow erosion. And what this causes is for the population itself to change. As I said, the population gets older in important ways, like, first of all, because young people leave because there's no opportunity. You can't get work in Pittsburgh. And again, this happens across the Rust Belt, that the population gets older, but also because these large cohorts of industrial workers who'd been hired at the end of World War II and during the Korean War, like in the 40s and 50s, this is when they're reaching retirement. And so this kind of last big pulse of industrial hiring is reaching old age at the same time as these jobs are not being replaced, and so young people are leaving. The population, in addition to getting older, obviously gets poorer in important ways, right? People lose access to the only good jobs that there were for working class people. And then finally, the population gets sicker. And this happens in two ways. One is just direct health shock, like an economic shock will generate a health shock through a million different mechanisms, through stress, through addiction, and kind of cascading phenomena of different kinds coming off of those mental health struggles. Right, there's like observable kind of spikes in presence in domestic violence shelters, addiction centers, this kind of thing. Heart attacks even seem to go up. But additionally, additionally, first of all, the population is also just aging, right? And older populations or sicker populations. There's this health shock phenomenon, which I should say also about that. Some economists did a study like in the 2000s of the records of people in Pittsburgh or in Western Pennsylvania who had had high seniority industrial jobs and then lost them in the early 80s. And they said, we have a list of everyone who this describes because they all, they would have filed for unemployment. And so we can just look at who filed for unemployment from a high seniority industrial job in the early 80s in Western Pennsylvania. And then we can see how long they lived. And from that, we can construct a measure of the health consequences of really rapid job loss. And what they found was that if you were such a person, a high seniority industrial worker who lost your job between 1980 and 1986 in Western Pennsylvania, your risk of death in the immediate aftermath went up to 50 to 100%. It then gradually leveled off again. But if you think about on top of that 50 to 100%, all of the people who, are therefore must be sicker, right? Even if they're not dying. You have a picture of it. And finally, on this, there's also a way in which, and this is key to the argument of the book, a way in which when deindustrialization happens and there's this kind of cascading social catastrophe and it overwhelms families and, kind of eats away at intergenerational security has been accumulated in savings and home ownership and so on, where are people going to turn? Really, it turns out the thing that they can lean on the most is the healthcare system. And this, again, is not deliberate. Nobody even quite realizes this is happening at the time. But it turns out that deindustrialization causes what health policy people call health utilization to go up really fast. And part of that is this kind of like increasing direct sickness that I was just describing. But part of it also is that there are a lot of kind of social needs that happen as your economic situation is disintegrating and as your community is disintegrating. You have all of these social needs. And many of those social needs have some health aspect. And if you can kind of take that health aspect and bring it to a healthcare provider, you can get some service for your social need. And I think the best way to understand this is if you imagine a family, a man who gets a job in a steel mill in 1950, when in his 20s, reaches retirement in this moment at the point of deindustrialization. His sons or his sons-in-law are not going to be able to follow him into the mill, he increasingly and his wife increasingly have kind of chronic health problems because they're getting old and because accumulated toll of a life working in a steel mill and living near a steel mill. And the sons are sons-in-law are trying to leave town to move to Phoenix or Dallas or something like that, where there's economic growth and where they can find work. But then their wives are saying, well, who's going to watch our parents if we go, right? I'm worried about our parents. Why don't we stay? I'll find something. And what that means is that this is the moment when deindustrialization causes large numbers of working class women whose mothers were housewives to enter the workforce, right? Because they have to supplement the wages that their husbands can no longer bring in. And as they do so, they look for what's growing, right? Where are they hiring? There's really only one answer, which is the healthcare system, the only thing not shrinking. And meanwhile, if you think back to the older generation, right, their daughter, who they used to call to come, cook the meals, do their laundry, take care of them if they slipped and fell or their arthritis was acting up or whatever, she's not as available anymore because she's working down at a hospital or a nursing home, which means that they have to take their retiree insurance, which is really good insurance, thanks to the Steelworkers Union, and go get themselves some care down at the hospital or nursing home. And so hospitals in particular, for a long period of time, take on this function that is kind of like nursing home-like, or sort of medium-term care is a way that I think about it. And they also have all these kind of social work type functions that they take on. because they had this population that is simultaneously getting older, poorer, and sicker, and also is very well insured. And it's that process that pulls working class women increasingly into the healthcare workforce, especially white women. African American women have made that entry earlier, typically, and begins to kind of recompose the working class.
You're covering a bit of the ground I was just about to ask about, which is there's some interesting parallels, I think, between some of the dynamics you're talking about and like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and the healthcare as a fix and also prisons as a fix for crisis. I'm wondering if you maybe could speak a little bit more to those parallels and also
Yeah, was there something else? You said also, and then trailed off.
Yeah, I cut myself off. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sure. So I don't know if everyone here knows the Ruth Wilson Gilmore argument, but it's basically an argument about how deindustrialization in California generates all these kind of social and economic imbalances, different kinds of what she describes as different surpluses, surplus population, that's unemployed people, and also surplus land, surplus state capacity. I mean, the details of this not being important for the comparison, but the point is, like, as capitalism goes through these cycles of creative destruction, right, as it transforms itself and discards elements of its kind of previous shell, right, abandons factories, abandons communities, remakes new ones, whatever. It generates these kinds of imbalances where you have people without employment over here, and you have goods and services that aren't being provided over there, and so on. And so part of what I'm arguing in the book is that like prisons, which arise to rebalance such an imbalance, right, to absorb surplus population and provide a kind of infrastructural investment that will allow for more profitable capital accumulation, especially in rural California. Similarly, in some ways, hospitals grow countercyclically to absorb some of the imbalance created by deindustrialization in the Rust Belt. And in that way, there's a quite close parallel to the growth of mass incarceration, which I think, although we want to be careful with it, is worth drawing out a little bit, because both of these are stories about surplus populations, right? About people for whom capitalism is no longer, who no longer offer really any value for capitalism, right? In the case of punished people, incarcerated people, that's people whose labor is no longer valuable. In the story I'm telling about Pittsburgh, that's part of it, but there's also a dimension of sickness, age, and disability. And there's different ways to be in the surplus population, and it's better to be rendered surplus by aging than rendered surplus by racialized punishment and abandonment, certainly. That's why we need to be careful with the comparison. These are not identical experiences, but nevertheless, I think we can observe the ways that they have some similarities to each other, especially if you think about a nursing home, right? A nursing home is a kind of a quasi-carceral institution at its worst. Not all nursing homes are always like this in every regard, but in fact, in the 70s, Pittsburgh has a very bad episode of nursing home abuse at this massive 2,200 bed institution where it's overcrowded because they have all of these old people who don't have anyone to take care of them and don't have any money, and it's understaffed because the local government, it's a county-owned operation. The local government is in a fiscal crisis because all the steel mills are closing down, and that's where they get their taxes from. And so you have overcrowding and understaffing, and that's the basic formula for nursing home abuse. What winds up happening is that basically it turns out that staff are chemically and sometimes mechanically immobilizing patients on kind of large scale because they can't handle them. And then in some cases sort of torturing them when they resist. And so it was when I came across that story that I first saw this comparison, right? That there's something going on here very similar in some way to the kind of simultaneous expansion of the prison system. The most important difference politically, in my view, is that we don't want prisons to exist, right? I think most of us on this call would probably agree with that in some way. And the operation of prisons is has a kind of fundamental violence to it that has really no redeeming quality. Whereas, I think probably most of us want there to be a healthcare system in some way, even if we could imagine very different ways of organizing it. And moreover, if you think about the workers in these two institutions, the very different kind of political roles that they come to play, I think is important. Right? Prison guards have become one of the kind of main forces of far-right reaction in our society, right? Because it's their job to enforce the racial order. Whereas healthcare workers are obviously, in a very different position in some ways than that. And, it's not to say that every healthcare worker is automatically like a socialist or something like this, but in fact, healthcare workers have demonstrated kind of a lot of the labor militancy and even kind of socialist politics that you can, it's one of the larger concentrations among American workforces. If you want to look by industry, where you find those things, healthcare, along with public education, academia, and to some extent tech, these are pretty good places to look right now. And I think that's not coincidental. So, the kind of rebalancing of surplus and absorbing of surplus, so the healthcare system functions as a shock absorber, creates something new. And that's part of what I also try to argue in the book. It creates this kind of new healthcare system that, it's expanded a ton and hired a ton of people in these kind of exploitative conditions. And that in turn creates a new situation for class conflict, basically, and class struggle.
All right, thanks. We're going to open it up for the audience now. If folks have questions for Gabe, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand or say you have a question in the chat. So if you want, we can take you off. Folks have questions. Taylor and I have lots, but I already see someone on the stack, so we'll go with the bell. And
yeah, sorry for jumping in really early, but it's kind of related to the very last thing you said. So you talked earlier about the working class, kind of seeking private welfare, and how healthcare kind of develops, the healthcare industry develops alongside that. Can you talk a little bit about going further when we get to Carter administration, and ideas of Medicare for all, quasi versions of that first being proposed? If I remember, there's now the healthcare industry is organized enough to resist that, right? If you could just talk a little bit, how did it go from medical association, like Blue Cross Blue Shield started as a medical association somewhere in the middle of California? How did that turn, nonprofit, turn into an entire industry that could push back? I don't know if that's relevant to your system.
Yeah. It's a very complicated story. Actually, the first efforts to have socialized health insurance go back to the 1910s, in the same moment when workman's comp was first passed, when what were called mother's pensions, which eventually developed into what we would call welfare, when those were passed, when there was a big movement to pass unemployment insurance, although that wouldn't come about till the 30s. And in the same moment, basically progressive intellectuals and reformers, working with the Wilson administration, wanted to pass a health plan. They did it state by state, basically, but it didn't work anywhere. Then in the 30s, in the same moment when the Social Security Act was passed, it was tried again, this time at the federal level. So the Social Security Act was written by a body called the Committee on Economic Security that was appointed by the Labor Department. Big committee of national experts and industry representatives and union representatives and so on. And it took on a bunch of different topics, right? The Social Security Act is not just the thing we call Social Security. It's also unemployment insurance. It's also what we call welfare. Let's say, different kinds of cash aid to the poor. And has various other elements in it too. And the report of the Committee on Economic Security more or less says it would really make sense while we're doing this to implement the National Health Plan. It sort of seems politically kind of tricky to pull off right now. The doctors are really, really freaked out about it. So let's do it next year. And so they kind of put it off for later in the New Deal. And indeed, that's what Harry Truman tries to take up after he becomes president in 45. He proposes a bill that is essentially a kind of version of Medicare for all. I mean, it wasn't called that because Medicare didn't exist yet. And I mean, from my perspective, of the many defeats of universal healthcare, this one in the 40s is the most important, which is why I kind of emphasized it before. The president is really behind it. He has this big new, labor movement behind him. Coming off the victory in the war, it seems like it kind of should be possible. But really, it's the Cold War that kind of messes it up, and the way that the Cold War is kind of generating discord and disorganization in the labor movement and throwing the labor movement back on its heels, and giving ammunition again to organized medicine. Like the AMA is really like the main force blocking, political force blocking this at the time, because hospitals and insurance companies are not that powerful, as your question suggested, at this point in the 40s. Insurance companies barely exist in healthcare. Life insurance and that kind of thing existed, but health insurance barely existed. Hospitals were largely like single institution nonprofit entities. They were not hospital chains or anything. So it's the doctors and the alliance of the doctors with the Republican Party in the context of the Cold War and the weakening of the labor movement that succeed in this moment. And it's worth saying also, just to kind of add a little bit of further details to that story, at some point, actually, the CIO, the kind of heroic industrial unions that had formed in the 30s, kind of see the writing on the wall and realize, before Truman had stopped fighting, they realized this is not going to work, and kind of like call off the dogs and stop pressuring legislators. And so there's a weird moment where Harry Truman, who is like not that left-wing of a president, is out there fighting for this, and like turns around and the labor movement that he thought was behind him is kind of gone. And this is when they turned to pursuing the private sector solution instead. And then in 1949, the federal courts rule that healthcare and pensions are what's called in labor law mandatory subjects of collective bargaining. So if you have a recognized union, your employer must negotiate over that with you. Then in the 60s, right, there's Medicare and Medicaid, which I talked about before, but were widely expected by a lot of sort of left liberals to pave the way automatically in some way to a universal program. It will just sort of expand them gradually or something. That didn't happen. Carter makes this attempt, not at universal healthcare, but at a kind of Clinton-esque healthcare reform in the 70s. It completely falls apart, as again, the left is not good enough for the left. It was a pretty bad proposal in a lot of ways. And the right sees the opportunity to oppose him and they kind of tear it apart. And that then, it falls off the agenda for a while. And this brings me, I think, to a key moment. So I'm sorry again for a long answer. I've described how over the course of the 60s and 70s and early 80s, the healthcare system expanded really, really rapidly, functioning as this kind of shock absorber, or rebalancing the surplus. This happens, for basically, private health plans, but also, of course, for Medicare and Medicaid. And Congress gets freaked out by the early 80s that the Medicare bill is ballooning. So the way that the process of deindustrialization turning into healthcare demand turns up in national politics is in the politics of the Medicare budget. And basically, Republicans and Democrats in the early Reagan administration agree, we can't have this. We have to impose austerity in some way on the healthcare system, which has been totally shielded from the kind of economic mayhem of the early 80s. It's benefited, in fact, it's grown as everything around it has contracted. We have to bring some disciplinary pressure onto it. And so they changed the way that Medicare reimburses hospitals in the early 80s. And this sounds like really, really dry, so just bear with me for a moment as I explain it, because it's actually extremely important. It's the most important change to Medicare, I think, after its passage in 65. So from 65 to 83, if you were a Medicare patient and you went to a hospital, the hospital and doctor did whatever they were going to do. They, whatever they thought was best. They kept you for 10 days or whatever and did their various procedures. And then the hospital accounting department tallied up how much all of that cost the hospital. And they basically sent a bill to Washington for like 102% of their cost. So this was like the fiscal mechanism by which that rapid expansion happened, was cost plus reimbursement. Costs for a hospital were revenue, and the more costs you had, the better. And so, naturally that kind of enabled and to some extent encouraged this kind of expansive use of the healthcare system for all of these different kinds of needs. We shouldn't blame people who did that, right? They weren't getting their needs met elsewhere, and the healthcare system was the only place where they could do this. Get someone to look after their dad who they couldn't look after anymore or whatever. But that becomes an argument in Washington for fiscal austerity, which takes the form of changing reimbursement from retrospective cost plus system to what's called a prospective payment system, which is still in effect today, in which basically the federal government comes up with a list of about 500 what they call diagnostic related groups, DRGs. And if anyone works in healthcare, right, these are very much still around. When you hear about medical coding, this is what you're hearing about, is a case being assigned which diagnostic related group does it go with. When the way this works is when a Medicare patient is admitted to a hospital, the hospital is made to choose which diagnostic related group they fall into. And there's like a price attached to it already. There's a fixed price sheet. The hospital can then do whatever they want. They can keep the patient a long time. They can discharge them quickly. They can, however they want to go about it, up to them. They know what they're getting paid. This really transforms the healthcare system over the course of the 80s and 90s. Because, first of all, private insurers then also move into this kind of reimbursement model. So it proliferates across the economy. They have to negotiate their rates, right? They can't impose them the way Medicare can, but it's the same kind of prospective payment. Basically, the kind of community hospitals that used to have the kind of core shock absorber function, like every steel mill town outside Pittsburgh, there was the mill, and then 2 blocks up, there was a hospital. Everyone in town had been born in that hospital. Everyone in town died in that hospital. Everyone went there for whatever kind of needs. Those places all go under over the course of the 80s and 90s, because now it's totally unremunerative to, keep someone for like a long time for relatively low level care, relatively non-intensive care. That had been their whole business model. In contrast, the kind of already wealthier, larger, and more capital-intensive hospitals, in particular the academic hospitals, prosper off of this system, because what they can do is specialize in the really high reimbursing, complicated treatments that the community hospitals can't do. Transplants, spinal surgery, cancer treatment. And so they get really big and fat, and the community hospitals kind of starve and eventually start to go under. And the big academic hospitals buy them out, close some of them down, keep some of them operating, depending on whether they think there's a market. And you start to get the emergence of hospital chains. As that happens, insurers start to get freaked out, right? Because insurers have to negotiate their rates with the hospitals. If the hospitals are consolidating and the insurers don't, then the hospitals are going to have all the leverage. And so the insurers start to consolidate and also to convert from nonprofit to commercial entities, and to some extent even to buy hospitals, and hospitals start to launch insurance companies. This happens in Pittsburgh. So you used to have Blue Cross of Western Pennsylvania insured everyone in the region, and you had these community hospitals. The hospitals consolidate, Blue Cross and Blue Shield merge, and then Blue Cross starts buying, or Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is renamed Highmark, starts buying hospitals to compete with the consolidated hospital chain. The hospital chain launches its own health insurance plan to compete with Highmark. And for a period of time, neither of them would admit Highmark would not allow people it covered to go to the main hospital company with its, so the biggest insurer would not pay reimbursement to the biggest hospital company, and the biggest hospital company would not accept insurance from the biggest insurer. And it's just like total system dysfunction. So basically, it's this kind of like the way that the kind of ground level dynamics of like first class struggle in and around healthcare, causing it to grow, and then healthcare functioning as a shock absorber, the way that rises up into these kind of questions of corporate form and kind of market structure in healthcare, eventually caused the emergence by the 1980s and 1990s and into the present of these kind of large, powerful healthcare corporate interests, which didn't really used to exist. And then the really fucked up thing about it is that, of course, people's fates are tied to these interests, right? Like Highmark might take advantage of you, but if it's the insurance you have, you kind of need Highmark to do well and to have the upper hand over the hospital. And so every time healthcare reform is attempted by Clinton, by Obama, the Democrats calculate that you can't get around these interests. You have to just buy some of them off and deepen this overall structure, because these kind of healthcare corporate interests actually command some amount of like political loyalty, because people are worried about, they're losing their insurance or losing their care.
I'm a higher ed worker, so I want to follow up on something related to that, because part of the story here, I think, is about the impact that those changes we're just talking about then had on universities that had those hospital systems connected to them. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and does that dynamic help explain how hospitals and also universities became so such a big driver of displacement?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, this is something I've thought a lot about and been in many political struggles around, but I don't have as systematic an account of. The relationships between hospitals and universities are extremely complicated. For example, where I work at U Chicago, the university owns the hospital outright, and it's just a kind of revenue source. I did my PhD at Yale in New Haven, and there, Yale University Hospital was an independent corporation. There was a very complex set of kind of interlocking contracts, interlocking boards of directors, but they had somewhat different interests from each other. One was union represented, one wasn't. Similarly, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, right, this giant behemoth in Pennsylvania, and now has like 40 hospitals or something, over 100,000 employees. You would think it would be a public entity, because University of Pittsburgh is a public entity, and the workers at University of Pittsburgh are unionized under public sector labor law. But University of Pittsburgh Medical Center has sufficient autonomy that it's a private nonprofit. So that's all to say, like, I'm not sure to what extent there are general answers about how these relationships work between academic institutions and healthcare institutions, except that in general, they are able to feed off each other, typically, to some degree. And that emerged in particular in the 1980s. And then I guess the other thing I would say is, as you alluded to, in urban politics, right, as these two kinds of institutions, because of the ways that they're organized, have not shrunk or did not shrink over the course of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s as cities around them shrank, right, that kind of elevated their relative size and importance, often even, their absolute size was often growing too, right, because they're attached, I see Doug saying in the chat, because they're attached to state subsidy in a different kind of way, right? And so steel mill closes down, it doesn't necessarily cause the university and hospital to close down in the same way. I think that has meant that they became increasingly powerful interests at the local urban scale. And this has real consequences in all kinds of ways. I mean, first of all, for local government, I mean, these are tax exempt entities, right? This has become a huge issue in lots of cities, that like your largest economic actors, the largest landowners, the largest employers are tax exempt. Like I said, I did my PhD in New Haven, and in New Haven, I mean, Yale and Yale University Hospital, like, own everything. This is in part what made me think of this project, was like, what are these monster nonprofit institutions in these deindustrialized cities? New Haven used to be a weapons manufacturing center. And like, what are the social relations that they bring about? And one of them is clearly at the level of like tax and fiscal capacity of local government. Another is that these institutions are very interested in raising the property values around themselves, right? Because that will further increase the value of this non-tax property that they have, which they can then sell or rent out or whatever. And will also typically attract the kind of population that they want to have nearby, right? They would rather have affluent and white populations near themselves if they can. And many universities have, because they're fixed in place in these cities that change around them, they often have found themselves surrounded by populations they don't want. And then engage in very deliberate gentrification programs to try to get rid of that. They also typically have private police forces. Here at UChicago, I think we have the largest university police force in the country, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are all these kind of complicated, and it's not even saying anything of the labor relations. So there are all these kind of complicated relationships that ensue from the ways that because of the weird position of universities and hospitals in and around the post-war political economy, they were able to persist and even to grow amid contraction. They then kind of spilled over into kind of dominating the lives of their communities in a different way.
Apologies again to Doug for stealing his question. But so next in this deck, we have Will.
Hey, yeah. I think this book, Gabriel, is just so important. I'm wondering how we can utilize this strategically to organize, because this industry is so huge, and then we have patients, that extractive abandonment, these two that are not separate. But I think your book does a really great job. For me, it was just really an enlightening way to see it, this extremely complicated system explained how workers turn into the super exploited, and how the patient and the worker, their common predicament. And that seems like a way, instead of trying to organize around Medicare for all policy wise, but how to organize linking these two groups. And I just want to sum up to say, I'm from the South, Winston-Salem, where we had the big Local 22 organizing drive and civil rights unionism at the Reynolds plant in the 40s. And now our biggest industry is healthcare. And I've been a healthcare worker for 30 years and later a labor organizer. We've seen all this like DRGs where the patient, the amount that goes towards treating a patient, they're trying their best to curtail that for these DRGs. And it's the same kind of things that probably, to a lesser degree, what a tobacco worker in the 40s had to deal with, speed ups, all kinds of really horrific things. And then also the healthcare industry being built on Black workers, and mainly female Black workers, transporters, food service workers, and housekeeping. And it just seems like your book and Health Communism are like two books that we really need to have a good grasp of if we're going to make a fundamental change, because capital is all bound up in this. And then so are we as workers. And I'd love to hear if I'm sure you put plenty of thought into that, and I'm sure that was a motivation for writing it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Health Communism. That was the book I was going to recommend at the end. Thanks for your question. I appreciate the kind words about the book. I think that there's a kind of paradox, I think is another paradox is worth talking about here, which is the way, at one level, with the process I've described to you all, the process the book describes, I think of it as like a very, very classic example in some way of what is, from Marx's perspective, the central kind of dynamic contradiction of capitalism, which he identifies as the growing socialization of labor and the private appropriation of profit. And I promise I'm going to get more specific than this. And what he means by that, right, when he says the socialization of labor, what he's describing is interdependency through work, right? So like rather than each of us being kind of peasant households where we depend on our family unit and maybe some of our village for what we need to survive, what capitalism brings about is the socialization of labor, right? I produce books and lectures, you produce something else, and we buy and sell, or our employers buy and sell stuff to us. So we're dependent on each other's labor for our needs. But that dependency on each, or that interdependency, which is the kind of like creates the liberating potentiality of capitalism, is warped and deformed by the fact that, we don't depend directly on each other, but rather is mediated through our bosses, right, who profit off of that interdependency. So like at some level, I think that's what the book is about, right? It's about this kind of new iteration of deepening interdependency, the way the healthcare system becomes the kind of webbing that connects the population to each other and allows them to kind of survive together, even through quite serious duress. And that should create some kind of political potentiality, in my view. However, I think it's also important to say what's different about healthcare work, to get more specific, as compared to like industrial work that preceded it. healthcare work lacks a bunch of the features that we think of as being pretty fundamental to labor under capitalism. Right. I mean, if you go back to like Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith describes how, the famous example he begins The Wealth of Nations with, which is a pin factory. And he describes how you could take, each person making one pin complete and break that process up into lots of people making different parts of pins. And you'll have all these efficiency gains. And if you do that, you can then sell pins for less, but you'll still make more money. And so you can pay your workers more, and then they can go out and buy more stuff too. Right, this is connected to the Marx socialization of labor idea, but in a kind of positive way. And everybody wins, right? So you have the division of labor bringing about increasing productivity, which causes prices to fall and wages to rise and living standards to go up. And then you think about healthcare, like none of that applies, right? Prices don't fall in healthcare, wages don't go up in healthcare. And in fact, productivity doesn't really increase in healthcare in the way that is was long thought to be fundamental to capitalism. But this is one of the defining features of capitalism, is that enterprises engage in kind of the continuous increase of productivity, meaning producing as much or more use value for the same input. I think that there are complicated reasons in the care economy generally for that kind of non-productivity increase. It's been talked about a long, long time in health economics. But I think it means that when you have an industry like that, in a capitalist society, it's going to impose a series of zero-sum choices. Because what productivity increase does, as in the Adam Smith example, is to some extent it can create situations, if you have enough of it, it can create situations where everybody kind of wins, right? I mean, we would be right to say, well, there's still losers and winners, but the whole pie is getting bigger. Without that, right, the only way that you increase the product, the scale of the product, is just making people work more. The only way that you hold down costs, if you can't increase productivity, is by holding down wages. And so this means that there's this very strange paradox where at the level of like society as a whole, right, our demand for healthcare is like enormous and bottomless, and has only increased over the last like 60 or 70 years. Just goes up and up and up because healthcare takes on all of these social functions, does all of these things for us as a society. And this causes an enormous system level pressure to grow. But at the level of the individual firm, right, an individual hospital or nursing home or home care agency, the incentives all work the other way. For an individual hospital or nursing home or home care company, what you want to do is hire as few people as you can. While still, carrying out, providing as much service as you can while hiring as few people as you can, right? And that creates this really perverse situation where, like, if you ask any healthcare worker, I see Will nodding. If you ask any healthcare worker, like, what's the problem at your job? Whether it's, the fanciest MD down to the people who, work in the kitchen, they will tell you it's staffing. And if you then think about your own experience as a patient of the healthcare system, I mean, the healthcare system dehumanizes and exploits us in millions of ways, right? So I don't want to say this is primary, because like some of us experience the healthcare system, fundamentally through like how we can't afford our bills, right? Or there's a lot of different ways that it fucks us. But, I think a pretty common experience, I would venture, for people on this call is feeling like you cannot get a hold of someone, you cannot get anyone's attention, you can't get someone to pay attention to. My mom has very serious cancer. She got diagnosed in 2019. And my mom is like, a pretty affluent white lady with good insurance. And it's like the length that she has to go to get like more than 2 minutes of attention in a month with terminal cancer and good insurance. It's just unbelievable. Right? I think you probably all recognize what I'm describing here, right? And this is the patient version of this experience. And so from my perspective, that when you put all that together, you can see the outline of a kind of a common interest, right, between workers and patients, as Will was saying. But that common interest is not in shrinking the healthcare system exactly, right, which is often how healthcare reform and even Medicare for all are often kind of advertised and talked about. We can make it more efficient, And yeah, there are millions of efficiencies to be had. There's tons of paper pushing that doesn't need to happen. All this profit making can get reallocated for sure. But actually, in a certain way, I think it's sort of politically generative to think about, okay, well, now we've brought all of these people into these relationships of interdependency. We've created this situation, not really deliberately, not really necessarily, as a kind of best rational possible path, but it's happened, where like the healthcare system is what binds us to each other in a lot of ways, along with the education system and childcare systems and so on. What would it mean to take that socialization of labor and put it into a political form? Could we do that? And here I think we run into real challenges, and they come out very clearly if you compare healthcare to, say, public ed. So, in public education, it's publicly owned, right? And typically in a jurisdiction, there is one union that represents almost if it's unionized, right? If it's outside, Right to Work South or whatever, there's one union that typically represents most of the people who work in the school system, i.e. the teachers union. There's other people there too, there's custodians, there's bus drivers, but the teachers union speaks or can speak for the public schools and their needs. And this, I live in Chicago, where this is like a major dynamic, as you all know, I'm sure. And in turn, you can have political struggle over what should our schools do? What should students get out of them? What services should they provide? What's their role in society? Let's fight over that politically. That's much, much harder to do in healthcare because healthcare is privately owned, largely, and because it's occupationally much more fragmented, right? If you think about the distance between, an oncologist and, that kitchen staff person, right? That's huge distance as compared to that between, a senior teacher or even a principal, right, and the bus driver or the cafeteria worker or whatever. There's many, many more unions in the mix. It's common for hospitals to have 5, 6, 7 unions in one hospital, even if they are unionized. So that creates all these difficulties, right? Who speaks for this possible collective interdependence? What's the agent? What's the body that can do that? And, I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me that it's pretty urgent that we figure it out. And that it probably can't just be a union, right? It probably has to be some kind of coalition organization. I mean, in some ways, I think DSA should a larger, stronger DSA would actually generate this, right? Like a kind of organization that could bring workers and patients together across the various kinds of divisions that I've just described, and kind of speak for the common interest that we have in a humane healthcare system. And not just speak for it at the level of lobbying for Medicare for all, but speak for it at the level of fighting, over, people's medical debt and, in the everyday, right, and representing you in your fight for medical debt, maybe showing up with you, or, obviously showing up for picket lines, but also helping organize unorganized workers, representing patients in nursing homes that are understaffed and abandoned and, abusive. And they're like, where is our kind of collective capacity for that? And it seems like as socialists, we should be trying to figure that out.
So I think we got apologies for anybody who's on stack. I got Taylor for one last question, and then we're going to talk a little bit more as we were just a second about the DSA and also additional political education stuff.
Thanks, Dave. Last question for you is, we invited you not just because of your book, but also because you've been in the struggle. You're a union organizer, and we were excited to see the news. I believe Yale formed their graduate union a week or two ago. And so just want to ask how your book, the work that you came to us to describe, was affected by your experience as union organizer and experience organizing on campus as a graduate worker, because I do believe we should all be organizer intellectuals. And so definitely want to hear how it influenced what we heard today.
Yeah, I mean, it was totally central and formative for me. And in some ways, I often joke to people that like the book is actually using Pittsburgh as a kind of like allegory of New Haven, or like it's trying to kind of tell a story of something that was happening to me by telling someone else's story. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So New Haven, as I said, it was an industrial town, major Great Migration destination. And by the 21st century, had been badly deindustrialized. It's about 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Latino. And it has this incredible economic inequality, right? We have this institution at the heart of the city, excuse me, right, which is like, it's like more powerful than the United States in some way, right? It like predates the country. The CIA came out of Yale. It has an endowment of tens of billions of dollars. There's carve-outs for its various rights that are written into the Connecticut state constitution, because again, it's older than Connecticut. Then you have this town around it of like, it's sort of like Detroit, essentially, around an institution like that. That creates a very kind of challenging and promising political situation at the same time, because, on the one hand, like the power of the employer is so overwhelming, and it just like totally pervades your consciousness if you don't have some external place you can stand and look at it from. You just get like, for a graduate student, you just like get turned into a Yale person, or in this disgusting way, and you see it happen again and again. But at the same time, because of this incredible imbalance of power, workers at Yale were forced to unite in a different kind of way than happens at most universities. And so in the 30s, there was a CIO union that initially organized the power plant workers, and that gradually grew into being the union of kind of blue collar workers on campus, like custodial staff, dining hall workers, maintenance, etc. And that was a largely black union for most of its existence, still now, has always been a largely black union. And in the 70s, that union decided to increase its own dues to fund an organizing campaign for the clerical and technical workers, of whom there were about 3 or 4 times as many as there were the blue collar workers. This is a very famous fight. It was central in the history of HERE, which later Unite Here. A lot of whose national leadership came out of this fight. But it was a very interesting and challenging struggle, because you had this basically black blue collar union trying to organize this largely white pink collar union. Right, it was largely sort of semi-middle class white women who worked in the clerical and technical jobs, and it took years and years. They won their election in the end by, I think, like 8 votes or 13 votes or something like that. There was a very bitter strike, but they won. And so then in the 80s, you had these 2 unions, Local 34, Local 35, brother and sister unions, as they're often described. And when graduate students began organizing in the 90s, in the early 90s, they turned to those to join them also, turned to Unite Here or HRE to join it also, which meant that when I got there in 2010, although that campaign had not yet succeeded, you had this situation of kind of campus industrial unionism, where all the workers on campus were or were trying to be members of the same union. And that came out of the kind of intense polarization of the city and against the town, I think, ultimately. And it meant that if you were going to try to organize the graduate student union, you had to like talk to people I organized all these science departments because I was not scared of walking into labs and talking to strangers. So I would walk into astronomy labs and chemistry labs and whatever, and try to talk to them about, here's what's going on for the custodians right now. They're having this fight over subcontracting, and here's what's going on for the clerical workers. Their jobs are being moved to a shared service center, and there's a fight over their pension. And here's what's going on for us. And here's what these things have to do with each other. And try to kind of involve people in that way and make them feel that they were in some way closer to the custodian who cleaned their office than the professor who supervised them. We didn't win in my time. The union just won recently, but that experience gave me a very, very different way of looking at the post-industrial city. Because New Haven, like Philadelphia, where I grew up, like Pittsburgh, which I eventually studied, had this story that it told about itself as kind of rising from, this post-industrial phoenix rising from the ashes, right? That young, creative, educated people are moving back to the city and they're revitalizing it, and they're living in lofts and they're making art or whatever. We all heard a version of this about many, many cities. And like, that wasn't untrue, exactly, right? I was that. I was a PhD student moving to the city. I didn't live in a loft, but you get the idea. But you could look around and see like, oh, there are all these other people who are part of this institution who are tied up with it somehow, as other workers, first of all, but also as neighbors who are being gentrified out of their homes, or as people who are in debt to the hospital, or people who are being hassled by Yale police or whatever. It was everywhere, right? People are tied up with this institution who aren't young professional creatives or whatever. And moreover, when you recognize that, you start to look at yourself differently and say, like, well, what if I'm actually not revitalizing the city? What if I also am exploited by the university in some way, right? And could persuade my coworkers that we should actually affiliate ourselves with this larger world of working class New Haven. So, I have many, many stories I could tell about that I won't because of time. But I guess the thing I want to say about it is that the main realization I had out of that appeared sort of was ported directly into the book was that these post-industrial institutions become sites of class formation. The inequalities that accrue around them and the ways that they entangle themselves in the lives of people who've been abandoned by capital entangle themselves, through employment, through policing, through housing, through healthcare provision, through a million other things too. But that generated the possibility that these different kinds of entanglements with these post-industrial anchor institutions could yield a form of solidarity, right? And that, again, that form of socialization of labor, we're all kind of tied up with this institution in different ways. We're kind of, I depend on the custodial worker to clean my office. The custodial worker depends on the grant money that I bring in, whatever. That you could make something out of that. And that idea basically got ported over directly to Pittsburgh, as I say.
That is a great place to end our discussion. I'm going to ask folks to just stick with us for one more minute. We got a couple of things. The one thing I want to say is thank you so much for Gabe to coming and talking about this with us. And thanks to everyone who came. I highly want to recommend, unsurprisingly, that you should read this book. I encourage you to read this book with comrades, discuss it with them, think about the lessons in the spaces you were in where you can be organized, as we always do. Gabe, did you have any other things you might suggest for people who want to dig in more in terms of readings here?
Yeah, I mean, Health Communism is really great. I was glad to hear that recommended. This is only partly germane, but I want to recommend the book On the Line by Daisy Pitkin, which is a memoir by a union organizer. And it's the only book I think I've ever really read that accurately gets at what union organizing is. I mean, the kind of passion and intensity and difficulty, like why it's hard to organize a union and why that difficulty occurs in between people and is a human relational challenge. It's just a really wonderful book. So On the Line by Daisy Pitkin and Health Communism by Beatrice Adler Bolton and Artie. Here, I'll put it in the chat.
All right, so back to Taylor for a couple other announcements before we all go on our way.
Yes, thank you, Dave. So I have the last phase, and that's how to get involved in organizing, whether it's political ed like this or just organizing in general. And I hope it has the same effect on you as it had on Gabe. So first off, we'd love if you joined, if you're not already a member, join the Democratic Socialist of America. Regardless of whether you're in DC, this is one you can do. And if you are in DC, there is email address where you can join the chapter Slack to see everything going on. Second is we have priority campaigns. We are organizing. This is not a spectator sport. There's no such thing as an unorganized socialist. We're organizing around labor. We're trying to organize workplaces in DC. We're trying to organize defund MPD. We're trying to take money from police and give it to things that actually make us safer and actually benefit people. There's the defund MPD program. We're also running the We Power DC campaign, which is trying to make our utilities public to fight climate change, lower our bills, and 2 housing campaigns. One is fighting for rent control in Montgomery County, try to get that legislation over the line to protect renters, and Stomp Out Slumlords, which is organizing against evictions and organizing people's buildings. And so if any of this sounds like something you want to fight for, and I hope it does, please join us. But this is an education event, and I'm going to detail how to find us in the future, even if you're not in DC. So you can find the past on our chapter website and the chapter's YouTube page. This meeting was recorded, is being recorded. You'll be able to find it. But also, I don't know how you found us, but the best way is probably through a weekly chapter newsletter. Short link there, mtcdsa.org/subscribe. It is an amazing resource for the chapter and the district beyond. Last, we're setting up a political education Google group. If you've been to one of our events before, you may have been added. Please click accept if you got invited. And if you haven't, look at that link and find us in Google Groups. And then I assume many of you found us or saw us in social media. There is a Socialist Night School account. And also you can find Metro DC DSA chapter accounts. We generally advertise through them as well. But what next? So we think there are three things specifically in Metro DC DSA coming up. If you attended this event, you may want to get your hands on something tangible that relates a little bit to the next shift in this topic of healthcare. We're organizing three things. First, learn more with comrades. There's not a next shift group, but there are 14 or so other ones. Capital Volume 1, Marxist Museum, Animal Liberation Potlucks, Nonfiction Writing, so much more, amazing variety, and they're kicking off soon. Make sure to sign up. You can find those on the chapter website, since I'm not posting in the links as far, unless someone is. And then reproductive justice. So it would have been the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, but abortion rights are under attack and people are dying in childbirth, and we are fighting for abortion rights and reproductive care. First public facing meeting is February 1st, which is next Wednesday. And then they're making abortion care kits, assembling them on Sunday, March 5th. We'd love to see you at both of those. And so they also have a social media presence. No links yet, but you can find those on their social media. Then last, we are part of the Political Education Working Group for Metro DC DSA. Our next meeting is Sunday. And if you would like to organize, shape an event like this, be part of our walking tour or reading group or lead a reading group, it's the type of event we'd love you to show up for. There are lots of things, and we'd love your ideas for how to bring socialist political education forward. And then perhaps most importantly for our night school, the next one is February 8th. It's Dan Berger coming and talking about his new book, State on Freedom, which is about intergenerational struggle in the Black Power movement, and essentially about love and family and the struggle. And I'm glad you have been part of this event. And State on Freedom is a hybrid event with an in-person component, and then but it'll also be available virtually for those who are not in DC. And that brings us to the end. So I don't know if Dave has anything to add, but we're so glad you could come. So thankful Gabe was here and brought some excellent information from his new book. And I hope I see you next in the struggle. Dave?
Yeah, I just want to say I hope to see you all either online or in person at our next event, or at a working group meeting and all these other places. So thanks again to everyone for coming. Thanks to Taylor and Abel for putting this together. Thanks for Gabe for putting it on. And have a good night.